Welcome to Podcast and Business. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. There is currently political polarization in the United States regarding sustainable investing and environmental, social, and governance metrics, also well known as ESG. My guest for this episode is Urban Larson. Urban is a sustainable finance advisor and professor of sustainable investing at Duke University. We discuss why ESG metrics have become politicized these days and the critical aspect of his interesting article, ESG Backlash: Why Politicians Attack Sustainable Investing. Urban, how are you?
Just fine. Thank you for asking. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for being my guest in this episode. Urban, we are living in a very politicized times, and it is an election year in the US, right, as well. The metrics, environmental, social, and governance, ESG, and sustainability are part of the conversation in the political and, of course, finance and investment arena. In this episode, we will going to discuss politics and ESG. Part of the country is pro-ESG, and another part of the country is against ESG. And all the states have different approach to ESG. So I would like to start this conversation by asking you why the metrics ESG has become politicized.
It was never meant to be political, but I think what happens is that activist shareholders threaten a lot of people. So you have company management that is entrenched and doesn't like it when shareholders challenge them on issues such as compensation, labor practices, human rights, or environmental questions. You also have the oil industry, which has invested a great deal of money in lobbying against taking climate change seriously and is, of course, trying to keep investors from incorporating climate risk into their investment analysis. And you have politicians who see an opportunity to use this as almost as part of the culture wars. I mean, we had a Republican presidential candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's based his entire career and his presidential campaign on being anti-ESG. Exactly. And I think this is really, really too bad, but it's a reality. I think one argument against ESG that a lot of these opponents are falling back on harkens back to Milton Friedman, who said the only social responsibility of a company is to deliver profits for its shareholders. And so the argument many opponents make is that ESG is interfering with profit making. It is adding an additional social purpose to a company that it shouldn't have. And so that, I think, is the intellectual basis of a lot of the criticism of ESG, but it's been ramped up to a very large extent by political interests who see an opportunity to gain from doing that.
Yeah, that's very interesting insights, Urban. I always like to break some concepts or ideas, Urban. If we break down the acronym ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance, in your opinion, which of the three, E, S, or G metrics is the most politicized, in your opinion?
That's an interesting question because I would say that G, governance, is the key to everything. Good corporate governance is what allows shareholders to have influence over the board of directors and over the management of companies in which they own shares. And there is absolutely a lot of interest on the part of wealthy members of boards of directors, of top management of many big companies to keep shareholders away. Because they ask difficult questions, they challenge people on compensation, they demand voting rights, they demand all kinds of things. And so that's but having good corporate governance enables the shareholders to make change. But really, lately, the heat has been primarily on the environmental side. And I think this comes from both directions. Many of those who are worried about climate change are increasingly worried about climate change. It's seen as an emergency by a lot of us when you look at how much the globe has already warmed, the devastating effects it's already have right here in Massachusetts. For example, a community on the North Shore had paid for their own money to have their sand dunes replenished after a storm in January, and just this past weekend, another storm came along and washed it all away. So something that's really happening right now in front of our eyes. And so that has led many investors to really put this front and center in their investment strategies. We've seen some very big investors say we're divesting from fossil fuels because of this. On the other side, you have the oil industry, whose interests are directly threatened by this movement, which has spent a lot of effort over the years convincing people that climate change was not real, and is now able to prevail on state governments in certain states where they have big oil sectors to penalize investors who are divesting from fossil fuels. What I think is striking is that this debate is not really being had in other parts of the world. In most of the world, climate change is an accepted fact. In Europe, for example, they have set up a market that prices carbon emissions, and companies need to pay for the carbon they're emitting into the atmosphere. It's no longer controversial, and most big European pension funds have divested from fossil fuels or are very focused on, ESG issues. It's completely routine in Scandinavia, the UK, the Netherlands, and some other countries in Europe. And yet here in the US, it's become very heated.
For a moment, I thought, I don't know if you agree with me, DEI and other social movements were more politicized than G and than E. But for a moment, I thought that S was the most, in my opinion, it is, but, from your insights about the G, it makes sense.
Well, the S is also very politicized. I think certainly the right has been attacking diversity, equity, and inclusion nationally for the last couple of years. Other social issues have been perhaps less political, because certainly where the social issues began was when shareholders wanted companies to take a close look at their supply chains. For example, Apple has come under considerable pressure for the labor conditions in the factories where its contractors make iPhones. Campaigns like that have not been as political. I mean, they threaten company management just as much, but there does not seem to be the same organized lobby against that kind of effort. Maybe it just doesn't slot neatly into politics the way climate change and diversity, equity, and inclusion do.
Let's talk a little bit about the elections that are coming in November, right? I think we already have 2 candidates.
Yes, we know what it's going to be.
Yeah, and we know who they are, by the way.
Yes.
I was thinking, when I was preparing for this interview, in the recent years, we have seen significant progress in let's see, more awareness from the society and how important sustainable investing is, sustainability itself, the ESG reporting, more companies are reporting, very, very well. The infrastructure, more people are using electric cars. We see, different kind of units where the car can charge in CVS, in Walgreens, etc., and more. So my question is, much progress has been made in sustainability in these years. How can the November elections results affect this progress?
I think that's a really good question. And what takes me back to 2017, or actually 2016, when soon after Trump was elected, and Trump was very much an opponent of ESG and very opposed to doing anything about climate change. I was at an investment conference focused on sustainable investing in New York, and the overwhelming consensus at the conference was Trump is too late. The train has left the station on sustainable investing and on taking climate change into account when investing. At that point, 2 of the biggest public sector pension funds in the U.S., CalPERS in California, the New York State pension fund, had both divested from fossil fuels and were quite vocal about it. They're being followed by other California and New York pension funds. And, clearly the retail demand was also increasing quite a bit. Where the Trump administration made a difference before was, first of all, by attacking shareholder rights and weakening the governance pillar of sustainable investing of ESG. And they did this by having the SEC pass new rules that made it harder for shareholders to propose resolutions, harder for shareholders to challenge board members, and a few other things that really were a direct attack on shareholder rights in an attempt to keep shareholders from using their influence over corporations to move them in a more sustainable direction. If Biden is reelected, I think that's probably a very much similar environment as to what we have now. The SEC has just published new rules requiring greater disclosure on climate risk. If Trump were to return to power, I would expect a full frontal attack, first of all, on shareholder governance. Again, returning to the rules that make it harder for shareholders to have an influence over company management, followed by likely attempting to copy the rules that Florida and Texas and other places put in place that actually forbid pension funds from considering ESG factors in their investment decisions, which in fact the Department of Labor under Trump was attempting to do already. So I think that the concern is that any second Trump administration would be likely to be more determined and more organized on these issues. But given the size of the pension funds that have already committed to investing sustainably, that doesn't mean that that won't be reversed.
I was thinking about it. For example, what about the big banks, the financial institutions, the consulting companies like a McKinsey, Bain, or Ernst Young? They are talking all the time about ESG, sustainability. They are involved in this kind of movement, etc. What this company will do, redo everything again? You can imagine the amount of money that it is, the frameworks that restart everything from zero.
I think we're already seeing some of that. We have seen JP Morgan, for example, has pulled back. I believe it was JP Morgan that withdrew from a financial sector climate initiative. So I think that absolutely some of the big financial players are already retreating because of the political pressure and will likely keep doing so. Others will not. You mentioned McKinsey. McKinsey's issued some very good reports on sustainable investing, which I have had my students at Duke read. I don't think that will change. Banks, I think, will be quieter about this issue. I think one sector that has a lot of weight on the debate particularly on the environmental question, is the insurance industry. The insurance industry is extremely exposed to climate change in Florida, also in California because of forest fires. And what we've seen is in both of those states, insurance rates have gone up substantially. Insurance companies have pulled out of certain markets, or in some cases out of the state altogether. The biggest home insurer in Florida now is owned by the state government because the private sector companies are just not offering much coverage. And the insurance companies are not doing this for ideological reasons. They're doing it because it goes right to their bottom lines. And if they're going to have to pay out much bigger losses than they have in the past, they have to either raise their premiums or get out of that particular business. And they're doing both. And no politician can do anything about that.
I want to talk to you about your article. 2022, you published a very interesting article titled ESG Backlash: Why Are Politicians Attacking Sustainable Investing? You mentioned sustainable investing is not meant to be political. The goal is to do well by doing good, which I agree, to enable investors to generate attractive returns while aligning their investments with their values. Can you elaborate a little bit on this point?
I think it depends on who the investor is. There are a lot of nonprofits that have a particular mission, and they engage in what they call mission-aligned investing. So, for example, the Rockefeller Foundation, which was started with a large pile of oil money, of course, decided a number of years ago that climate change was one of the biggest issues they wanted to address. And they said, wait a second, we cannot invest in oil on the one hand, while on the other hand, we're trying to mitigate the effects of oil. So they sold all their oil stocks. That was very, very clear decision. I am on the investment committee of an affordable housing nonprofit in Roxbury in inner city Boston. And the issues that our board cares about in particular, and said, do not invest any money in weapons of any kind or in for-profit prisons, because those are two issues that they feel very strongly about. That's perfectly appropriate. For an individual, it's a little bit different. And I think doing sustainable investing properly entails not just rejecting certain investments, but also seeking out investments that are furthering the goals you want. For example, you don't just not invest in fossil fuels, you invest in clean energy. And an argument made against sustainable investing is that you're reducing the range of options you can invest in, and that's going to hurt your returns. The counter argument is made by some. For example, when Harvard divested from fossil fuels, they said this is a bad long-term investment, and we are long-term investors. And so we have to think about what our endowment not over the next 5 years, but over the next 50 years. And so they started unwinding their position because they said this is a sector that's going to do badly and it will hurt our endowment. I think that Republicans who don't want to make these choices are falling back on the classic portfolio theory, which says you need to have a diversified portfolio, and that all a company is supposed to be doing is giving profits to its shareholders. Whereas people who are doing sustainable investing are saying, if I'm a long-term investor, I want companies that are going to do well over the long term, and companies that are paying attention to ESG factors are likely to do better over the long term because they're looking much more closely at the context they operate in. They're paying much more attention to their effect on their communities, on the labor force, on the environment. And so they're much less likely to give you a nasty surprise in the future. And that's kind of the apolitical argument for sustainable investing is these are companies that are higher quality and better suited as long-term holdings. And at the same time, perhaps, maybe it matters to you a great deal to have your values reflected in your portfolio. You can do that in a way that is not just restricting what you own, but looking out for the good things. And you often miss out on some nasty things like, if you didn't own BP, you were not hurt by the massive platform explosion and oil spill about 10 years ago, which was a huge disaster for shareholders.
Let's keep with your article. There is a very interesting. You just mentioned Republicans. According to the New York Times investigation, Republican state treasurers are working with organizations such as State Financial Officers Foundation, the American Petroleum Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and the Climate Heartland Institute to block efforts by the financial sector to combat climate change. So my question is the ESG reaction fierce and well organized?
Oh, absolutely. I think you have a confluence of lobbying and funding from the oil industry with a number of politicians who see this as in their interest, and they're clearly working together, and ideas spread from one state to another. I mean, interestingly, to a large extent, they're shooting themselves in the foot. For example, last year, the Houston Chronicle published an article estimating that in the first year that the law in Texas prohibiting Texas municipalities from doing business with banks that did not fund the gun industry or the oil and gas industry, then the first year Texas municipalities had to pay an additional $350 million in fees to issue bonds because there were fewer banks who were able to underwrite their bonds, and therefore the remainder could charge more. So what Texas has been doing is really shooting itself in the foot, raising the costs of the Texas state government, Texas municipalities, of issuing debt. And in addition, when Florida went after certain pension fund managers and said we won't do business with pension fund managers that run ESG products, even if they're giving us a non-ESG product, again, they knock out a huge number of good potential managers of their pension funds.
What would you like to add to the listener? For example, regardless of their political position in terms of sustainable investment, I would say I consider myself moderate in my political, viewpoint. I do agree with something from the left, and I do agree with some part for the right. So, person like me, for example, what would you suggest?
Well, first of all, I'd like to start with some basic principles, which is that sustainable investing is about making shareholder capitalism work. It is not about radically changing it. It's not about overthrowing the system. It's about saying, okay, capitalism is imperfect. We're going to make it better. And that capitalism needs to be better in order to survive. So that's, I think, the bottom line for me. As I say to my students, the market got us where we are today, and the market is going to get us out of it. And I think that the other consideration here is that for a long-term investor, I think investing sustainably is the way to go because you are giving yourself a higher quality portfolio with fewer chances of surprises, companies that are paying a lot more attention to every element of their business. For a short-term investor, it doesn't matter quite as much. You're not as likely to face these risks. And second of all, is the insurance industry shows the risk from climate change, the risk from other E and S factors is real. It can absolutely affect a company's bottom line, and companies need to be aware of it and need to adapt to it.
That's true. Urban, I don't know if you want to add anything to this conversation before wrapping up.
I would just like to go back.
What's going on?
Yeah, go back to my earlier point, which is I'm really sad that that sustainable investing has become so politicized. I think it should not be political. I think really this is about making capitalism more responsive to shareholders, more attentive to its consequences on society and the world, and therefore better adapted for the long term. When you have capitalism that does not respond to shareholders, not respond to the needs of the public, it will lose legitimacy. And that's what I think the opponents of sustainable investing don't understand.
Do you think that a conservative believe in climate change?
I can't get inside other people's heads. I would say that, as I said at the beginning, it's very striking that it's only in the U.S. that the existence of climate change is so controversial. Everywhere else, it's long since been accepted as scientific fact. It is clearly happening around us. I think that there are some people who generally don't believe it, some people who don't accept climate change because it's not in their short-term economic interest to accept climate change, and there are other people simply using the issue for political gain. But, for example, the state of Massachusetts is suing ExxonMobil because Exxon has known since the 70s that climate change was happening, and they hid this information from their shareholders, who should have known because it really does matter to your long-term investment decisions. And you question, is this a good long-term investment when there's this very large cost that is being hidden?
Before wrapping up, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yes. I think we've seen that in the financial sector with companies like BlackRock that touts itself as an exemplar of sustainable investing when in fact it is not at all, which makes the political attack sound all the more ironic. Transparency is key because when you have a company that is owned by one group of people, the shareholders, and run by another group of people, management, the shareholders need to know what's going on. And often management doesn't want to tell them what's going on.
Why not?
Why not? Well, because it hurts their interests. Management has different interests from shareholders. Shareholders want to know that they're going to get a good return on the money they gave to the company. Management wants to ensure itself, good compensation and a long tenure at the company. The two can be in tension. They're not necessarily in tension, but there are obviously times when managers don't want to disclose things that shareholders need to know. And so that's really at the heart of corporate governance is shareholders' need for transparency, and the board of directors is there to ensure that shareholders get the information they need. Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen.
Urban, where can people contact you?
The easiest way is probably through my website. The address is www.whitepineadvisory.com. And there you can see articles I've written, contact information, and so on.
Urban, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. Thank you so much, everyone. The views, information, or opinions expressed in this episode are my own and do not represent my employer's views.